Hey everybody, thank you for joining me for another tier list. Today we're going to be taking a look at the discography of the English band New Order, a group who was a key contributor to the new wave movement, as well as post-punk, synth-pop, and all of the different styles that exist within those worlds. And they're a group that made some amazing musical contributions throughout the decade of the 80s, and then they had some more spaced out releases from the 90s to the present day, but they have continued to evolve their sound throughout their almost 40-year period of their discography, and the amount of influence that this band has had just cannot be overstated. They have influenced countless bands from the 80s to the present day, as well as being pioneers in multiple different genres of music, so I'm very excited to be covering them for today's episode. And what I'm going to do is go through their 10 studio albums, starting with Movement and going up to Music Complete, and I'll score each of them on this tier list, with S being the highest and D being the lowest, and I'll talk a little bit about each album, let you know my thoughts, and we will see where we end up. And please feel free to let me know your thoughts in the comments, where you agree and disagree, and how you would rank these 10 albums. I would love to hear your thoughts. Alright, I think that's about it. Let's jump right into it. Okay, starting out, we have their debut studio album from 1981 titled Movement, and I will give this a B. I think this album is pretty good, but I do think they have records that would follow it that are much better. And to be fair, this record was recorded under less than ideal circumstances in their personal lives. I'm sure everybody listening is already aware of this, but for anybody who doesn't know, New Order consists of 3 of the original members of the group Joy Division, and after the death of their vocalist Ian Curtis, they formed New Order and continued writing music with this new lineup, which consisted of Bernard Sumner, Peter Hook, Stephen Morris, and added member Jillian Gilbert, who is the only non-Joy Division member of the group, and at the time was Stephen Morris's girlfriend. And stylistically, this album picks up from where Joy Division had left off, with those post-punk and rock elements being more present on here than on any of the records that would follow it, but still implementing some electronics and synthesizers here and there, which is a sound that they would delve much more into on future releases. So for people who are a fan of Joy Division, this would be the New Order album that is the closest to resembling that Joy Division style, which is why I do think so many people hold this album in such high regard. This does seem to be one of the Joy Division records that people are kind of all over the place on. Some people think it's one of their best, other people rank it a little bit on the lower side, and I've always tended to go with the latter on that one. I've listened to this album so many times to see if it would eventually click, but I'm always left with the same general feelings, which are sort of conflicting thoughts, because it does have some tracks that I think are amazing, but also has a handful of songs that just haven't grown on me over time. As far as the songs that I enjoy, I absolutely love the opener, Dreams Never End. That would be my favorite track on this album. It's a song with a really great energy to it, really pretty guitar parts, and solid vocals from Peter Hook. And I also really enjoy The Hymn. I think that track has a real darkness and eeriness to it that I really resonate with. And I also really like Doubts Even Here, which is Peter Hook's other lead vocal track. So I do tend to like the Peter Hook vocal tracks on here the most. And while the other songs definitely have some cool moments and interesting uses of textures and different kinds of synths, I don't find that these tracks really grab me and blow me away as much as a lot of the songs on future albums would. And I don't think any of the tracks on here would make my list of top 10 favorite New Order songs. So I think on my end, just from a stylistic preference, I don't find that I resonate with every part of this album. But like I said, it still has a couple of great tracks, and I can certainly appreciate it from the standpoint of the band trying to pick up the pieces after the death of Ian Curtis. And I think under these difficult circumstances that they were given, they still managed to produce some very high quality music that is sure to satisfy any Joy Division fans, and is an album that is regarded by many New Order fans as one of their best. And like I said, I'm not in that camp, but I can certainly understand why a lot of people do feel that way. So a pretty good debut album, but not one of their best in my opinion, so I will give this one a B. Alright, next we have their second studio album from 1983 titled Power, Corruption, and Lies, and obviously this one gets an S, probably not a huge surprise to anybody. An amazing album and a classic in the new wave, synthpop, and post-punk genres, and oftentimes this album pops up as people's #1 album in the New Order discography, and I do think this is an incredible record, but it's actually not my #1 favorite of theirs. For me, this one goes down as my third favorite record of of theirs. They do have two others that I like even more, but this is still a significant improvement from Movement. I think the sound and the style is much more defined and cohesive throughout it, and it captures that perfect blend of all of their different influences and creates this amazing fusion of post-punk, synth-pop, new wave, and dance rock packaged in a very beautiful way, and it just makes for a very fun and adventurous album that is filled with so many high-quality tracks. My personal favorite song on here would have to be the closing track, Leave Me Alone. In my opinion, this is the best closing track of any New Order album, and a track that would easily make my top 10 favorite New Order song list. And for opening tracks, I think this album also has easily one of the strongest openers of any New Order record with Age of Consent, which is one of their most well-known songs. So an incredibly strong opening and closing track, and some really great variety in between that, with some of my other favorite songs being The Village and Your Silent Face. I love the synth sounds on Your Silent Face. It gives me some serious Kraftwerk vibes, which is a group that I know was an influence on them. And I love the placement of that track. It's so upbeat and feel good, and it's placed perfectly at the midpoint of the album. So an incredible record that was hugely influential to the post-punk, synth-pop, and new wave genres, and was probably responsible for countless albums to come out in the future. So the influence and the innovative nature of this album cannot be overstated, and it's definitely one of the strongest records of the New Order discography. Just for me personally, I do find that there are two other New Order records that I like even more and resonate with the track listing even more, but I think it is perfectly reasonable that this is a lot of people's favorite New Order album because it really is a masterpiece and just a massive improvement from their first album, and really set up a new framework for them to continue to build off of on future records and produce more and more incredible albums from this point on. So a great album. This one gets an S. Alright, next we have their third studio album from 1985 titled Low Life, and I will also give this one an S. Another incredible album. This one would go down as my fourth favorite New Order album, so right after Power, Corruption, and Lies. On this one, we hear much more of a transition from the post-punk sounds of the first two records into a much more synth-pop and dance rock sort of territory. The record is 8 tracks long with 4 songs on each side. It opens up beautifully with the upbeat and feel-good Love Vigilantes, a great opener that does a really awesome job of establishing a mood for this album to build off of. Then it goes into The Perfect Kiss, my personal favorite song from this album, and a track that would definitely make my top 10 favorite New Order track list. This song is just so vibey. I love the groove, the synth sounds, the chord movements, and the vocal melodies. Just everything about this song is incredible. Then that is followed up with This Time of Night, and then Sunrise, which concludes side 1 on a more post-punk sort of vibe, which I think was a nice stylistic choice. And then side 2 delivers 4 more amazing tracks, opening up with Elahia, a beautiful ballad with lots of ambience and different types of synth layers, mixed very nicely with these guitars. A beautiful opener to side 2 that takes the listener on a little bit of a detour into some new territories. Then that is followed by Sooner Than You Think, which is a song that's groovy and it's got really tasteful synth sounds, but also has a nice mysterious sort of quality about it. Then we have my favorite track from side 2 titled Subculture, another rock solid synth pop track that gives us a nice little burst of energy to set up the final track of the album, which is Face Up, another song in that synth pop realm that concludes this album very nicely. So I love everything that they did on here, going much more in the electronic and synth pop direction, but throwing in some surprises here and there with the post-punk elements on Sunrise and the ambient elements on Elahia. So a great album that establishes a new sound for New Order, but still has the elements that stayed true to their roots and threw in a couple of surprises, which gives the album a lot of different dimensions and adds a lot of depth to it and makes for a very enjoyable listening experience. So another amazing album, my fourth favorite New Order album. I will give this one an S. Okay, next we have their fourth studio album from 1986 titled Brotherhood, and I will give this an S. Absolutely incredible album. This one goes down as my second favorite New Order album, and again, this is another one of those records that people seem to be all over the place on. Some people regard it as one of their best. Some people have it a little bit lower on their list, but I really think this album is absolutely fantastic. It contains a great diverse palette of sounds, mixing the rock and post-punk elements with the synth pop sounds that had started to become more prevalent in their writing, and they split it up nicely, with side 1 being more in a rock and post-punk sort of realm, and then side 2 goes into more of a dancey and synth pop territory. And while these contrasting styles might not be for everyone, I personally really enjoy it, and I think this record is a perfect representation of all of the sounds that New Order had explored and continued to develop up to this point in their discography. Side 1 gives us 5 amazing tracks, opening up with Paradise, which is in my opinion the best opening track of any New Order album. I like it even more than Age of Consent, believe it or not. I think Age of Consent is their second best opening album track, but I just think this song has such an awesome and dark energy to it that's very engaging and really grips the listener and just opens up this album perfectly. My other favorites from side 1 would be Broken Promise and Weirdo. Weirdo is one of my favorite New Order songs. I'm not sure where I would place it, but it is definitely in my top 5, maybe even top 3. I think it is an absolutely beautiful song. Side 2 then delivers 4 more tracks, opening up with the classic hit Bizarre Love Triangle, which would definitely be my second favorite song on here and would also make my top 10 favorite New Order song list. Just a perfect synth pop song with so many amazing synth sounds being layered and some seriously beautiful and catchy vocal melodies. My other favorite track from side 2 would be Angel Dust, and aside from those 2 tracks, a couple of other noteworthy moments that I really enjoy are the instrumental interlude in All Day Long, and I really like the choice and mood for the closing track, Every Second Counts, concluding the album on a more mellow note, which contrasts the more intense opening track Paradise. So I love this album. I don't think there is a bad song anywhere in this 9-song track listing, and like I said, I think this really showcases all of the different palettes of sounds that New Order was dabbling in up to this point in their discography, and I think it produced an incredibly consistent and very enjoyable album that has a lot of variety and surprise from song to song, and has a couple of tracks that I would regard as some of my favorite New Order songs. So an incredible album. My second favorite New Order record. This one gets an easy S. Alright, moving on, we have their 5th studio album from 1989 titled Technique, and I will also give this one an S. Another amazing record, and for me this one actually goes down as my favorite New Order album. And initially when I made this video, I was curious which album was going to come out as my favorite, because New Order has always been one of those groups where I never definitively really had a favorite album of theirs, but I knew I was going to have to pick one after going through and making this video. And this was one of those records where the more I listened to it, I was just more and more blown away at how many great songs are on here. And for me personally, I think this is their most consistent and most enjoyable album from front to back. Just top quality dance rock and acid house songs with a bunch of really standout tracks and a lot of great moments. It's 9 songs long with 5 tracks on side 1 and 4 tracks on side 2, and it opens up with Fine Time, which kicks things off with a very dancey vibe. I like this song, but I also think it's probably the weakest song on the album, in my opinion. I know that it's one of the singles and people love this track, and I still think it's a good song, but I think everything else on here is even better. From track 2 and onward, I do think the quality picks up even more. Side 1 continues with 4 incredible tracks, with 3 of them being more in the traditional New Order stylistic territory with the songs All the Way, Love Less, and Guilty Partner. And then for another more dance rock track, we have their classic hit Round and Round. I think these are all beautiful and incredible songs, with my personal favorites being Love Less and Round and Round. Side 2 then gives us 4 more tracks with a similar mixture of the styles, with 2 dancey tracks, Mr. Disco and Vanishing Point, and then 2 more traditional New Order tracks with Run and Dream Attack. Again, all incredible songs. I particularly love Vanishing Point. That would be my favorite song from this record and would make my top 10 favorite New Order song list. And I think Dream Attack is a beautiful, dark, and moody closing song that wraps up this amazing album just perfectly. And I think on here they really captured a beautiful blend of the more rock side of New Order combined with some more electronic and dance rock elements, and they did it in a way that produced some incredibly high quality tracks and a very consistent album from front to back. So this is my number 1 favorite New Order album. This one gets an easy S. Okay, next we have their 6th studio album from 1993 titled Republic, and I will give this a B. I think this album is okay. It's definitely not great, but at the same time, I do think it is a bit better than some people give it credit for. And oftentimes, when people talk about New Order's discography, they tend to separate it into two categories, with Movement Up to Technique being the first period, and then this album, Republic and Onward, being the second period. And this record was written and recorded under less than ideal circumstances. The band had partially owned a nightclub in England that was losing a lot of money, and their record label was dependent on them releasing another record, otherwise they were going to go bankrupt. So they were basically in a position where they had to make a record to save themselves financially between the record label and the club that they had money invested in. And to top it all off, Peter Hook and Bernard Sumner were not getting along at all, and it created a very tense environment for everybody. So as you could see, these were not ideal circumstances for making another album, and I think a lot of that shows in some of the music on here, because this album does have its fair share of skip over tracks. But at the same time, I do think it has a couple of songs that are really incredible. So this is one of those records that is very hot and cold for me. It's got a couple of really big high points mixed with its fair share of low points, and just makes for a very scattered album that I feel very conflicted about. It's 11 tracks long, and I absolutely love the way it opens up with the first two tracks, Regret and World. In all honesty, it's probably one of my favorite successions of two opening tracks of any New Order album. Regret is definitely my favorite song on here, and that one would also actually make my list of top 10 favorite New Order songs. I think that song is so unbelievably beautiful, and World is the perfect follow-up with that dark synth pop and dance sort of vibe. I particularly love the chorus on that track. And once we've gotten through those opening two songs, I do think the high point of this album has already happened, and it takes some dips in momentum on certain tracks from this point on. But I still think tracks 3 to 6 are fairly consistent, with the only song I'm not super crazy about being Spooky. But I do really enjoy Ruined in a Day, Everyone Everywhere, and Young Offender. But after that, I do think this album drops off a lot from tracks 7 to 11, with just a string of songs that I find to be pretty underwhelming, from Liar to Avalanche. And this string of 5 tracks is ultimately why I put it in B tier, and it's unfortunate because I do think 5 of the 6 opening songs are very good, and I think the record starts out incredibly promising with Regret and World, but unfortunately when it gets to that second half, I really think it loses all of that momentum that it has built up on the first half. But I do think the quality of the songs on the opening chunk of the album are still very high, and do increase this album's quality to a decent degree. If the opening half had been weaker, then I definitely would have put it in C or D tier, but I love Regret and World so much, and also really enjoy Ruined in a Day, Everyone Everywhere, and Young Offender, and because of how much I like those tracks, it didn't feel right putting this album in a worse spot on this list. And although this record was recorded under tense circumstances and was only made out of financial necessity rather than creative inspiration, I do still need to give them credit, because in the midst of all of that, I still think they managed to produce a handful of very good tracks that I will always go back and listen to as a New Order fan. So a fairly weak album that has some pretty big high points that redeem a lot of it for me. So I will give this one a B. Okay, next we have their 7th studio album from 2001 titled Get Ready, and I will also give this a B. I have very similar feelings about this one that I did about Republic. I would say that this is slightly better than Republic in terms of its consistency and track listing, but I do think the high points in Republic are better than the high points on this record. Another thing worth noting is that this would be the last New Order record to feature Jillian Gilbert, who had left after this album to take care of her and Steven's 2 kids, one of which had some health problems. And this record is 10 tracks long, and I enjoy 6 of the 10 songs on here, with my personal favorites being Turn My Way, which has a nice feature from Billy Corgan of the Smashing Pumpkins, and I also really enjoy Someone Like You, which instrumentally gives me some Imogen Heap vibes, which I love, just a very cool and vibey song. I also really enjoy Primitive Notion. The bass line on that one gives me some serious Joy Division vibes, which I love so much, and to hear that in 2001 is a very cool thing. Those would be the 3 songs that are the high points of this record for me, and I also really enjoy Crystal, 60 Miles an Hour, and Vicious Streak. I do, however, think that it's got 4 tracks that are pretty underwhelming, with Slow Jam, Rock the Shack, Close Range, and Run Wild, and these all happen within the second half of the album. So again, a very similar problem that I had with Republic, where it got worse in the second half, but I do think that Someone Like You helps out the second half a bit more, and the first 5 tracks on here here are all very solid. So another album that's kind of all over the place for me, but in the midst of that, there are still some great moments and some really standout individual tracks that should always be regarded as solid songs from the New Order discography. So another album that's okay, but not great, so I will give this one a B. Alright, next we have their 8th studio album from 2005 titled Waiting for the Siren's Call, and unfortunately I'm going to give this a C. Not a very strong album, in my opinion. I think it was just written and recorded during a weird period for the group and didn't result in a very strong and cohesive sound. This was the first album to not feature Jillian Gilbert on keys, and it would be the last album to feature Peter Hook on bass because of the tensions that were arising that we had discussed on a previous record. Stylistically, it's in that Britpop and alt-rock sort of territory, but I find a lot of the songs on here to be pretty boring and generic sounding, with a couple of good tracks sprinkled throughout. Of the 11 tracks on here, I would say that I only really like maybe 3 to 4 of the songs, which would be the title track, Waiting for the Siren's Call, which would definitely be my favorite song on here. Beautiful guitar layers, great vocal harmonies, and just an overall solid song that shows New Order operating at their best. I also really enjoy Crafty and Guilt is a Useless Emotion, which I think is a really solid dance track with a very catchy chorus and great layering between the male and female vocals. And I think Jetstream is pretty good, but I wouldn't say that I'm crazy about it. And in general, a lot of the other tracks on here might have some pretty instrumental or melodic moments that happen at certain points, but as overall songs, I do find a lot of them pretty generic sounding, and the material on here just doesn't grab me as much as any of the previous 7 albums do. So unfortunately, I would say this is the worst album of their discography up to this point, so I will give this one a C. Okay, next we have their 9th studio album from 2013 titled Lost Sirens, and I will give this a B. I think this is an okay record, and technically this is not an album that was released the way it was originally intended. The tracks on here were originally recorded during the production of the previous record, Waiting for the Siren's Call, and it was intended to be a follow-up to that record that was going to be released shortly after, but after bassist Peter Hook left the group in 2007, they never got to finish this album. And while I don't love every single track on here, I do think that it is a little better than Waiting for the Siren's Call. I think the quality of the songs is better and the track listing is a bit more consistent. This record is 8 tracks long, and I would say I enjoy 5 of the 8 tracks on here. I do think the first 4 songs are the more consistent point of the album. The 3 songs that I don't care for all happen on the second half of the album, which seems to be a theme with their past couple of records, and those tracks are Hellbent, I Told You So, and I've Got a Feeling, and I do regard all 3 of these as pretty weak and underwhelming tracks. Hellbent is a little too Britpoppy for me, and I Told You So would definitely be my least favorite track on here. I think it's a pretty boring and anticlimactic way to conclude the album. But on the flip side, it does have a couple of tracks that I really enjoy, in particular the opening track, I'll Stay With You, which I think is an absolutely beautiful song, and believe it or not, it might make my list of top 10 favorite New Order songs. I know not everybody holds the post-Technique albums in as high regard, but I think throughout a lot of these records, they still manage to put out some really exceptional individual tracks, and I would say a song like I'll Stay With You is a perfect example of that. I also really enjoy the follow-up track, Sugarcane, which would be my second favorite song from this record, and Recoil is another track that I really enjoy. I particularly like Bernard's vocals on this one. It's always given me some flavors of Tom York, which I find very enjoyable. So in general, this album kind of runs hot and cold for me, with the first half being very enjoyable, but the second half taking a dip in momentum, and the only song that I do find enjoyable from the second half would be Shake It Up, but at the same time, the opening 4 tracks are very strong, and I do think the good songs on here are of higher quality than the good songs on the previous record, and because it's on the shorter side, track length wise, the ratio of good to bad tracks isn't as out of whack, so because of that, it felt right to bump it up 1 tier higher. But still not one of their better records of their discography, but I would say it is a step up from Waiting for the Siren's Call, and does have a handful of very solid New Order tracks. So an okay album, I will give this a B. Okay, and lastly, we have their 10th and most recent studio album from 2015 titled Music Complete, and I will give this a B. Not a bad album, definitely not as strong as most of their earlier works, but I would say it is an improvement from the previous two records. This album marked the return of Jillian Gilbert on keys, as well as new bassist Tom Chapman, and this record takes on more of an electronic, modern synth-pop and dance rock sort of hybrid, and has a couple of surprise guest features like Iggy Pop, Brandon Flowers of The Killers, and Ellie Jackson from the synth-pop group La Rue. The album is 11 tracks long, and I would say I really enjoy about 6 of the tracks on here, and I do think the strong tracks do keep the momentum up for a good chunk of this album, but there's still a good handful of songs that I think are pretty weak, particularly the string of songs from tracks 3 to 6. I'm not crazy about any of those songs, and I don't necessarily think that the features were utilized in the most effective way, and it results in some tracks that just sound sort of out of place to me. And I feel the same way about the closing track, Superheated. But other than those 5 tracks, I do think the remainder of the record is great, with some really standout tracks like Restless, Academic, and The Game. Restless would easily be my favorite song on here and is an absolutely incredible way to kickstart this album. So I do think a little over half of this record is very good, but I could have done without a couple of the other tracks, and I think if they had omitted the guest features and just wrote a couple of more songs for the regular lineup, this album could have been enhanced even more. But for how far they are into their discography up to this point, I definitely don't think this is a weak album. I wouldn't say it's great, but I think that it shows they still have some solid songs left to write for us, and tracks like Restless, Academic, and The Game very clearly illustrate that. So a decent album, but not one of their best. I will give this a B. Alright, we did it. We went through their 10 studio albums, and this is what I came up with. I think the way I ranked this is pretty typical for an average New Order fan. I do find that most people tend to rank the first 5 albums higher than the second 5, and I think really the only areas where I might veer off a bit is by putting Movement in B tier and not having Power, Corruption, and Lies as my number 1 favorite of theirs. But other than that, I would say that this is probably a pretty standard ranking of their albums, and even though records 6 to 10 do get scored lower than the initial 5, I do still think there are a lot of really fantastic songs within those 5 albums, and I think they are still well worth exploring, and I hope they continue to still make records in the future. I wouldn't mind if they came out with another record at some point in the 2020s. I'd be very curious to see what kind of stuff they are dabbling with, and I don't doubt that there would be some really great individual songs on that record. So let's keep our fingers crossed for another New Order record in the future at some point, but if not, I still think this 10 album discography is amazing, and I think there's so much great stuff to be explored all throughout this. So that is it for today. Thank you so much for watching. I hope it was enjoyable, and if you are interested, please feel free to check out some of my other tier lists, which will be linked in the comments and the description, and see if there's anything else that you might like. And like I said, please feel free to let me know your thoughts in the comments, where you agree and disagree, and how you would rank these 10 albums. I would love to hear your thoughts. Alright, that is it for today. Thanks again for watching, and I will see you at the next video. Take care.